Hey guys, and welcome to video number 2 on the Persian Empire. Okay, Persia being the first of these major empires we're going to be talking about in this unit on state and empire building. So in the last video, I talked about the beginnings of the Persian Empire with the Achaemenid dynasty, with Cyrus and Darius and those guys. And today we're going to be talking about the institutions and methods that these rulers used to create a very efficient, while at the same time very massive empire. Now, when you have an empire, or even a large nation to this day, it's always important that the people know where the power is coming from. And in order to do this, you want to create an impressive capital. And in the Persian Empire, the capital was Persepolis. All right, so Persepolis was the capital city of the Persian Empire. And it was impressive, especially for that time. You know, the ruins of it have survived to this day. You can go to Iran, not that many Americans go to Iran, but you can go there and you can travel there and see the columns and the artwork etched into the stone and so forth. And it was meant to impress. It was meant to show the strength and glory of the Achaemenid rulers. Another thing that the Achaemenids did, which was very practical, was they divided the empire up into these things called satrapies. Now, a satrapy, think of as kind of like a state or a province. You know, they recognize that ruling the whole thing from their homeland, you know, in the satrapy of Persia, probably wasn't, you know, the most efficient way, you know, if they were going to directly rule every single area of it. So what you do is you put satraps in charge. Satraps were local governors. They were also local bureaucrats, very often chosen from the local people. Remember, one of the big calling cards of the rule of the Achaemenids, particularly Cyrus and Darius, was tolerance, about getting in good with the local people. So it just kind of made sense that they would have these local guys helping them out. That being said, they still wanted to keep direct tabs on everybody. And in order to do this, they had a pretty extensive spy network. They were called the eyes and ears of the emperor. And so these government officials would just randomly pop in. They'd go visit the satrap in Babylon or Assyria or Cilicia or Ionia or any of these. And they would come with big armed contingents, and it was a show of force, you know, to make sure that people were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Because as tolerant as Cyrus and Darius were, you had to accept them as being your overlord. You had to accept their authority. Otherwise, there were going to be problems, such as we'll talk about when we get to Greece. Now, the regulation of taxes, there was a fairly heavy taxation rate. Each satrapy had to give roughly about 20% of its crop production in, which was a fair amount, you know, and they wanted to kind of even things out. Make sure that they always sent that message, we're in charge, but they didn't want to overburden them as much. So there was some leeway there. But the regulation of taxes, making sure that there was a imperial tax that didn't matter where you were from, every satrapy and every subject had to pay. Now, a coin system, when you're paying these taxes, you know, if all of the different satrapies use their own currency, that can get very confusing. It makes trade very difficult. You know, think of the United States when the Articles of Confederation was the first kind of governing document after independence. The different states could make their own money. You know, imagine if you had to change money going from New York to Pennsylvania or Massachusetts and so forth. Creating a standard coin system, the Daric. You know, they were gold, you know, and, you know, they'd have the pictures of the kings on them and so forth. It made things a lot easier. It made things uniform. So now you could regulate trade better throughout the different satrapies. Additionally, making a uniform law code. Now, Darius was really the big figure in this. Cyrus started it, but Darius really kind of finalized it. And this was based on Hammurabi's code. They took an awful lot of the Mesopotamian law code. Again, you know, taking, learning from the people you conquer. They didn't try and go in and say, our way is the only way, and we will not accept anything that you people already do. They looked at Hammurabi's code, and they said, this is a very well-established law code. The people here are used to it. Works for us. Why try and reinvent the wheel? So a uniform law code, but making sure that it was uniform from one end to the other. Okay? Whether you were in Gandhara or you were in Ionia, crimes were treated the same, punishments were the same, and so forth. And in order to facilitate, these royal court officials as well as the spies and trade, there was the Persian Royal Road. The Persian Royal Road was a series of roads, but it was mostly one road. Let me erase this. That ran from Sardis here to the winter capital of Susa. You can see Persepolis was a little bit beyond it, but this here was the main road that it followed. And it was big. It was roughly 1,677 miles and fairly well maintained. Parts of it were paved. Now, we're not talking with asphalt and modern concrete, but with cobblestone and things of that nature. And this was to facilitate the movement of the army, if you needed to move them from one area to the other, obviously for trade, but also for messengers. If these spy network, if they needed to get word to Persepolis or Susa that there were some problems going on in Tarsus or Comana or so forth, this Royal Road made things a lot more efficient. They had checkpoints every few miles or so where royal government officials could get fresh horses and resupply and so forth. So it was a very well maintained, very efficient system of travel, transportation, and communication as well. So the Achaemenids, they really set the standard for imperial rule. They laid the foundations that other empires, namely the Romans, would follow. When you think of the legacy of the Roman Empire, some of the things that first come to mind are the Roman laws and the Roman roads. Well, both they looked at to the Achaemenid Persian dynasty as example. They said, well, that worked very well for them. We should try that as well as some other policies such as tolerance, inclusion, while at the same time recognizing the authority as well. Now, the Achaemenid dynasty was not going to last forever. It did fall into decline. It actually fell into decline shortly after Darius's death with his son Xerxes. Okay, and so, we have a picture of Xerxes. No, that is not the correct picture of Xerxes from the movie 300. The reality is Xerxes he wasn't 9 feet tall. He wasn't nearly as flamboyantly dressed either, probably a lot duller. But he was Darius's son, and Xerxes made a couple of mistakes as a ruler. One, he ended a number of policies of tolerance and inclusion that kept a lot of the people in the different satrapies calm. He started to really push a very heavy Persian-dominated influence. He also really took up the war against the Greeks that his father had started, but Xerxes really took it to another level. And so what is referred to as the Persian Wars, sometimes the Greco-Persian Wars, which we'll talk about later, obviously became famous, in the modern pop culture through 300. Xerxes was in charge of everything when that happened. And the end of the Achaemenid dynasty was solidified with Alexander of Macedon. Now, we'll talk more about him later, and as he's better known as Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great conquered through the Middle East and he led his Greek and Macedonian armies through, he ended the Achaemenid dynasty. Now, this was not the end of the Persian Empire, though. There were other dynasties that would follow, such as the Seleucid dynasty. We'll talk more about this later, but when Alexander died, his empire was split up amongst his general, and one of them, Seleucus, took the majority of what used to be the Persian Empire under the Achaemenids. Now, they were always looked at, the Seleucid rulers were looked at as being foreigners. They were descended from Seleucus, who he himself was Macedonian, Greek, so he was Hellenistic. We'll talk more about that later. So they were always somewhat looked at as outsiders, but still it was a fairly large empire. You see how this made up the bulk, he got the bulk of it, the Ptolemaic one in Egypt and then smaller ones in Greece. You think, oh, these guys got screwed, but in reality, they wanted that because that was considered better real estate because it was Greek. So they ruled for a while. After them came the Parthians. Remember Parthia, okay, this area right through here. The Parthians looked at the Seleucids as always being foreign invaders, so they booted them, and they were in charge from the shift from the before Common Era into the Common Era, so from BCE into CE. And then finally after them, here's, again, kind of the original homeland of the Parthians. You see the Medians and the Persians. And then after them, you have the Sassanid dynasty. The Sassanids consider themselves to be true Persians. They consider them to be the true inheritors of the Achaemenids. And they ruled for a couple hundred years after that, up until 661 CE, when they would eventually be overtaken by the Islamic Arab empires. Okay, and there you have the extent of the Parthian dynasty. Let me get rid of that so we're not confused. And then you have the Sassanid dynasty. Sassanid dynasty at its height was big. It would often come into conflict with the Byzantine Empire. We'll talk through here, Greece and Turkey. We'll talk more about that later. But it did conquer in and around the Arabian Peninsula. But as Islam and the Arabic armies would spread out here, eventually the Sassanid Empire was just weakened from fighting against the Byzantines for so long, and so they were easy pickings. That did not mean that Persian influence was dead, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the unit on these Arab empires and about the very, very strong influence that the Persians had in terms of culture and ruling style. Okay, so that wraps up video number 2 for the Persians, and be prepared to talk about this tomorrow in class.